I'll now recognize myself for a round of questions. And I'll be brief questions, brief answers initially. Mr. Cooksey, you and I, we've got 10 years of Iraq. You know, I've been here for a little over 12 years. I've had more than a decade of going to Iraq and Afghanistan. When I view Iraq, I view it through a prism of $143 billion GDP. Nearly a third of that flows directly through the government in oil revenues. The government has a lot of money. You and I have been in Iraq long enough to know that Iraqi reconstruction, some of it actually was reconstructing a country, right? I mean, a lot of it's putting it back. Mr. Sopko, Afghanistan's a little different. $20 billion, if you're kind, in GDP, much of it generated by the money we spend there. About $2 billion in revenue, most of it not through any, just sort of the accident of importation taxes and so on. But as was previously testified, $50 billion in military activity, $10 billion in direct military assistance, $2 to $3 billion of economic aid. Basically, we're paying everything that that country runs on. It's $2 billion of theoretical revenue doesn't go anywhere. Is that a rough statement?
You're absolutely correct. It's about $2 billion for revenue collected by the Afghan government. That's their revenue. It's at least $4 billion, 4 to 6, depending how you look at it, to just cover the Afghan national security forces.
Right.
Then to pay for the rest of the government is way beyond.
Right. So the government doesn't have enough money, doesn't collect enough, but also, and I want to be as unkind as appropriate in this case, Iraqi reconstruction is an oxymoron, isn't it? We're not reconstructing a country, we're constructing a country that never was. Isn't that pretty much true?
You mean Afghanistan reconstruction?
Afghanistan, I'm sorry. Iraqi reconstruction is to a certain degree reconstruction. When I flew in the first time and flew over those dirt and rock buildings with no roofs because they come and go and take the roofs, I saw Afghanistan as it is. When I went into the so-called palace, I thought of a middle-class home in Cleveland, Ohio, as the King's Palace. This was never much of a country. It doesn't have much revenue. And in fact, we are funding this country in multiples of what they could possibly do themselves every day. Isn't that true?
That's true, Mr. Chairman, but as you know, since I come from Cleveland, I have to defend Cleveland. Look, some of the houses I lived in, you know, yes. But
now, what I'm saying is you've been to the King's Mansion. If you've been to Shaker Heights, you've seen better homes owned by individuals, and they were upper middle class.
And I lived on the west side, Mr. Chairman.
You have my sympathies.
Shaker Heights. I was near Triscuit and West 144th. So
I've been there. You should have been in Shaker or Cleveland Heights. This is purely a Cleveland thing, folks. You don't have to participate.
Yeah. That's where my brother lives. He's the doctor. I was
He's the doctor. He's probably in Beechwood. But let's go through a little bit of that. $2 billion is what they really have of their own money. In the case of Kabul Bank, at least $1 billion was lost. That's a big amount of money. That was their largest bank. Is that correct?
That's correct, sir.
And with that $2 billion of their own money and $50 billion or so of our money floating around, is there any likelihood that some of that money lost wasn't U.S. funds? Isn't it inevitable that some of that was our money flowing through that bank that was lost?
I'm not certain of that, sir. We've never looked at it, but it was a major impact on the Afghan economy. It caused almost a crash of the economy when it failed. And obviously, we had to put money back in. And by we, I mean it was the Afghan central bank, and that money had to come from somewhere. And that was probably U.S. money or international money.
So ultimately, a Ponzi scheme that included high-ranking people that are closely associated with the ruling folks of the country, including the President, takes out a bunch of money, spends it in luxury homes in Dubai and so on, goes bust. The central bank, quote, bails it out, but we bail out the central bank, really. So the money, ultimately the money really is our money flowing through their country. Ultimately, we bailed out the Kabul Bank. We ate that loss of that corruption.
Mr. Chairman, we haven't looked into that, but that is a logical assumption that the recapitalization of the bank, which is required by the international banking community, did have some impact or could have had some impact on our reconstruction. The money had to come from somewhere. And since we were supplying most of the money to the Afghan economy, I think it's a logical assumption to make.
Given that, and given Mr. Carroll's statement broadly about direct aid, do you have any confidence in 1 penny of direct aid to the country of Afghanistan's government? In other words, do you have any belief that you can, in fact, trust writing a check, transferring money to this government, and expecting it not to be all or part stolen through corruption?
Mr. Chairman, I may be accused of being the eternal optimist. But
look, I'm a Christian. I believe in the redemption of souls. I haven't personally witnessed it yet in Afghanistan.
But, Mr. Chairman, I believe if you put in enough mechanisms on oversight, and that is our concern, make certain that you put it in and you hold their feet to the fire. They promised to clean up their act before we put money in. If you do that, and you ensure that the AID officials, the State Department officials, can get out there to look at the sites. I think it was a good point that the IG from SIGIR mentioned, that the SIGIR was the only oversight mechanism actually going out to see if the site was actually built. Was the school built? Was the road built? Well, that's what we're doing, and that's what my compatriots here are doing in Afghanistan. But if we don't have the security, we can't get out to look at the sites. We can't go out and see if the schools are built, the railroads are built, or whatever is spent. That's why it's so important that we don't negotiate this away as we're negotiating this money. So if we do have the oversight mechanisms in place and we hold their feet to the fire, I'm optimistic the money will be spent appropriately. But it's a challenge.
Well, my time has expired. What I'd like to ask all of you to do, we have the Kroll report now. It's being provided to all of you. This was a report that, from what I can tell, was deliberately not provided to you, was deliberately not provided to the U.S. government, was done apparently where ultimately there had to be an investigation, but the government in Afghanistan didn't want your forensic audit and your oversight. So I'd ask you to look at it and come back to us with your comments. We'll arrange both a public and or private dialogue. I know this material is pretty thick, but we're very concerned that this is exactly the audit, Mr. Sopko, that you're saying we need to have, that in the case of Kabul Bank we never got. And I share with you that exact concern, that if we cannot have it and have it effortlessly each and every time our billions are out there, we have no business putting more billions from the American taxpayer. And with that, I go to the ranking member.